So for 2024, I decided that it would be the year of Jane Austen for me. So I'm gonna try to read all 6 at least of her novels. I added Lady Susan as like a maybe, but of course I have like a little schedule for myself because who am I if not a planner? January is Emma, March Sense and Sensibility, May Persuasion, July Manfield Park, September Northanger Abbey, November Pride and Prejudice, and then December might be God, my cat. Okay, December might be Lady Susan. It's not technically one of her novels, it's technically a novella, but if I'm really feeling it, I might do it. I'm gonna leave it like up to my personal preference. Anyways, so to start is Emma. I am at like page 62 or so I'm not very far into it. I've started tabbing a little bit excessively. However, I am really enjoying it. I have read Emma before. This is technically a reread, but like I'm reading it with a lot more intention because I want to, for all Jane Austen novels, kind of like notice any feminism, so I have a tab for that. I know Jane Austen, and especially in Emma, has a lot of sass. So there is a sass tab as well. And then I looked up that like one of the major themes for Emma is classism. So, but also I'm realizing that classism is like the entire book, at least the first 62 pages, it feels like it's just constantly classism. So I'm trying to like not go too hard on the classism tabbing because I'm realizing I'm gonna run out of that color if I do that. And then the last one is Cher, because as we know, Clueless is based on Emma. And like anytime that there's a moment that I just feel is very much from that movie or reminds me a lot of that movie, I want to kind of like make note of it because I love Clueless. With that, I'm also reading Jane Austen's England, which kind of gives like a historical understanding of Jane Austen in the time period. It's kind of cool because it does like talk about certain moments in certain Jane Austen books and being like, hey, this is why they say this. But also it talks about like more generally life during like Georgian and Regency periods. So I'm kind of skimming it more than I'm reading it, to be honest, but it's just to like kind of give myself some kind of background information because I noticed in past times when reading Jane Austen, I'm always kind of like, wow, I wish I knew what that meant. Or like, I wish I knew like what the culture was, because I feel like this is like a culture social kind of thing and I don't really get it. So I'm hoping that this is going to help a little bit. The other thing with reading Jane Austen is that I noticed I have a really hard time concentrating when I'm reading it, and also I get really lost in all the different characters because it's like with one character it's like, oh, sometimes they call her Miss Taylor, but then she got married, so now she's Mrs. Weston, and then sometimes they use her first name, and then I get lost and I'm like, oh my god, who is who again? So with that, I'm trying to I haven't really made like a character map like physically, but I'm trying to like take note of that and like underline when someone's name appears and like kind of like give myself some kind of description to keep track of all of it. But then also, to help myself concentrate more, I am kind of doing a thing where it's like I'll read it sometimes just like as a print copy, and then sometimes I'll listen to the audiobook and follow along with the print copy, and other times I'll just listen to the audiobook. So like I'm kind of just like doing a lot of different mediums, and so far it's actually been kind of working and I've been enjoying it. The only thing is that like when I'm listening to the audiobook, sometimes I want to underline something or tab something, and in that moment I have to like run and like get the physical copy and like go through and figure out where I am. That's the only drawback, but I think it's going a lot better than other times when I've tried to read Jane Austen, so. Okay, you get the mic in the shot because it's really early in the morning and I'm not projecting my voice. But anyways, I'm going to my parents this weekend, so of course going to be taking Emma with me. I'm like, I don't know, a decent bit through. For like reading during the week, I'm in volume 2, so finished volume 1. So the rest of the vlog is going to be at my parents', at least like part of it. Probably not the whole thing. I don't know if you can tell that it is freezing outside. I woke up this morning and it was 14 degrees and I live in like east/central Alabama, so that is not normal. But we're making do. Leo's gonna try to crawl into this hammock. So, Emma, I'm officially halfway through. I would like to be able to look inside to see what I annotated, but I cannot. So I'm just gonna try to do it from my memory as it continues to settle. I've noticed that I feel like it's just, maybe it's just Jane Austen, maybe it's just this book, but so much is dialogue. And I had forgotten that. That's not a bad thing, it's just something that I've noticed that I feel like now with more modern day stories, it's a lot more like, let's describe the scene. And this is when we do short little dialogue, but this is like paragraphs of dialogue. Which is why I think an audiobook is working so much better for me, because I got so lost in the beginning of like, I don't know who's talking anymore. As far as the themes go, I've been focusing a lot on Clueless and like the overlap that I've been finding. Like there's like this one part with like Mr. Elliot in the carriage and he's like kind of like flirting with Emma, and I was like, oh my gosh, the car scene, if that makes sense to anyone. So like that's where a lot of the tabs are. Also just like classism, as I mentioned, and feminism, but not like in the girl boss feminism way, which I think we could probably assume, but more in like, oh, okay, she's like noting the ways that it sucks to be a woman, like pitting women against women between like Emma and Jane. And like there's one part where I know I wrote like, women are tools. I don't know why I wrote that. I don't remember. I'll try to pull it up when I'm editing. The passage that I was talking about, just to sum up, Mr. Elton was rejected by Emma, and then he went away to Bath for a little bit. While he was there, he got engaged/married to Augusta Hawkins, and it's just kind of talking about her. And they talk about how the fact that, like, yes, she's pretty, but also she's worth like $10,000. So I put, women are tools because Mr. Elton's really just using her for social gain and economic gain and not really anything beyond that. Where I am right now is Harriet and Emma and also Mrs. Weston are like in a dress shop, I believe, and they ran into Mrs. Bates and like they just said goodbye. But we had like this whole like page and a half of Mrs. Bates just talking, and I remember just writing, does Mrs. Bates have ADHD? Because like as I was reading it, I was just like, wow, this feels like when my ADHD friends are having like an info dump moment, and they start one thing and then they go to the next and then remember the other thing, and then they go to the next and they go to the other thing, and then they forget about the other thing, but then they go back to the other thing. And it felt very much like that, and I was like, is this ADHD slander? Is Emma against neurodivergent people? I don't know, it's a theory, but then again, I'm Gen Z. I think everyone has a mental illness, so it's like, who's to take my word? So that's kind of where I'm at right now. I am also filming this on like a Wednesday night, so I really don't have that much like brain power left to talk about what I'm reading, unfortunately. I'm very bad about talking about my thoughts of a book. Why did I think this was a good idea? So we're doing like a little bedroom setting filming situation. Leo also is like very distressed that I'm in here, and I don't know why. So he's gonna scream a lot during this. But anyways, with Emma, I don't know if you can see, but I've made some decent progress, mostly today, not necessarily really during the week, but like I woke up this morning listening to the audiobook as I was making breakfast, and then most of like the morning and mid-afternoon was honestly just me reading this book. And I thought I was going to be like really wanting to watch Clueless, because the last couple of chapters I've been noticing a lot of like allude, or a lot of how Clueless is alluding to Emma, and I've had like a couple more of those kind of tabs in there. But actually I've been really wanting to watch Emma, but like I think it's the 2020 version. I haven't seen the 90s version. I'm sure it's good, but it's just like, that's not the vibe that I'm craving right now. So I might actually wind up watching that tonight. The other thing that's kind of cool is that even though I do hate winter this week, because it's still, I don't know if you can tell by the hat, but it's still pretty much below freezing half the time. It actually is kind of neat that quite a bit of Emma, at least half, if not more than half, is set during the winter time, and I did not realize that when I picked that out for January. But it was actually neat because like there were snowing scenes and stuff like that, and I'm like, wow, this is like this is very atmospheric. I didn't realize it was gonna be that atmospheric, so that's kind of cool to me. But also I did want to talk about like other books that I'm reading, because I'm not just reading Emma. My big like fantasy book that I'm reading is Babel, which a friend recommended to me, and I know it's like one of the like dark academia books, and most people think of like fall being dark academia, and I do agree. I think fall is very dark academia, but I also feel like winter is. I don't really have like a case for it or anything, it's just how I feel. So that's been like, when I'm not reading Emma, that's what I've been reading. And then the other thing is my audiobook, which is it's a Court of Thorn, oh my god, A Court of Thorn and Roses, because I have like a sci-fi and fantasy book club that I try to go to regularly. Unfortunately, it's not as regularly as I would like. But anyways, they kept talking about ACOTAR, and I was like, what is this? I don't know what they're saying. And then eventually, I figured it out. And I'm not planning to like listen to or read the whole series. I'm like halfway through it, and I'm like, okay, this isn't really exactly my thing, but I was really enjoying it in the beginning. So I want to at least finish the book because I like the idea of it and the world building. And actually I do kind of like the writing. It's just like the romance isn't really it for me. It's just because I'm not like a smutty kind of reader, unfortunately. I find it very disappointing, but it's just the way that I am. So like there are some very smutty moments, and I'm just kind of like, why am I listening to this? Like, it's like 8:15 in the morning, and this is a fairy orgy that I'm listening to, and I'm on my way to work, and like I wasn't prepared for this at this moment. Also, like, she's very obsessed with like back muscles, and like I get it, backs are cool, but also like every single time that someone turns around, we don't actually need to talk about the back muscles, is my opinion on that. But I know I'm mostly just complaining about this book, but I actually am really enjoying it. I do think it's a very like fun read, and that's what I was really needing with my audiobooks, because I kind of go back and forth between that and like classics or like nonfiction. So every once in a while I'm just like, I just need something fun, because I'm trying to get to work and I got a 40-minute drive and I want it to be interesting. So I actually very much am enjoying it. It's just like, the romance parts just aren't for me. They're just not my taste, is basically it. But yeah, so that was a lot more about ACOTAR than what I meant to actually talk about. And I really didn't even say anything about Babel, so let me just briefly touch on Babel. It's another one where it's like, I'm enjoying it, but this one part I wish wasn't there. And it's just like, it's just the silver magic element to it, because it's, the thing is that I don't think I fully understand it is part of the problem. But basically there's like these, I guess, silver bars, and like you write on one end and then on the other end you write it in a different language, but it has to like coincide and be maybe not a direct translation, I don't think, but like similar vibes, same, you know, I don't know how to describe it. This is the problem. I don't really know what it is. I think it's a problem. But you also, something about how like you have to like fully be immersed in both of those languages for any magic to happen. And the magic is based on, I think, like, no, the magic is definitely based on like the words that you're writing. Like it's a cool concept, but I think it's just like, I don't know. It's just not, it's just not, I think it's back to the whole like, it's just not my taste is what it's coming down to. I don't know. But I think everything else about it's really cool. I like, you know, what it's talking about with colonialism. I've heard people say that like sometimes it feels too forced, and like I can get that, but I'm not always smart. Like sometimes I need it to be really forced. So I do like that aspect. I like the Oxford, you know, setting, and I like just the concept of Babel as an institution, and then we even have little maps of what like the different levels are, and I just think that's really cool. So like I really do like the world building that's happening. It's also one of those books where I'm realizing that I need to not just read like one chapter at a time. I need to binge read it a little bit more, and like really just go into it. Like just have like an afternoon where that's where I'm reading, because I think it's one of those books where that's what I need to do to like really submerge myself in the story, and I need that to be able to connect with like the characters and the plot. So I probably should do that once that I finish Emma. Yeah, that was so much longer than what I meant to even say. I didn't even talk about Emma that much, but anyways, that's the other stuff I'm doing with my life. Actually finished Emma last night, and I took a day to like think things over and actually write down notes of my thoughts, because usually I'm just kind of like saying whatever I think on the top of my head and I don't really plan that much out. But since this is like coming to an end, I wanted to actually like reflect on things. So I feel like the main highlight of Emma, and I think this is kind of shown through like a lot of different adaptations, is the character growth, because Emma goes through a transformation for sure. I mean, she starts off as very like spoiled, naive, kind of vain, and she ends up being, you know, very compassionate and caring. She's very considerate of others, and I think that's something that's in the beginning, but because of her own like ego and just like innocence about the world, it doesn't really shine through like how it does at the end. And I think that for me, like the moment where I really saw her character growth begin was during the ball scene, where she realizes that Mr. Elton, I gotta stop doing that, where she realizes Mr. Elton is not as great as what she thought, and she admits openly to Mr. Knightley that he was right and she was wrong. And that's like kind of like the pinpoint to me, and I feel like every single time that she admits that she's wrong is another step in character growth, because when we first meet Emma, there was no way that she would ever admit that she was wrong. I couldn't see her doing that in the beginning of the book. And I think that's something that does like still take a lot of guts. Like not a lot of people like to say that they're wrong, myself included. So like it takes a lot to admit openly to another person that you're wrong. And I feel like that she does that on multiple occasions really, but that's like the first instance. The other big thing that I kind of followed was feminism was like one of my tabs. And the thread that I kind of like looked at was the role of female friendships and female companions and how we compare other women to each other. So I think that's really prevalent with Jane, Fairfax, and Emma, because they wind up being rivals for most of the book. And then towards the end, they both kind of recognize that like they wish that they actually tried to be friends. And there's a couple reasons why I think that, you know, they wind up being rivals. There's some external factors. A lot of people like to compare the two of them. Let's see, I actually like try to write down page numbers to actually give examples of what I'm talking about. So like for instance, like when Emma's sister comes home and they're kind of talking about Jane Fairfax, and basically Emma's sister saying like, hey, she would make a really great companion for you. She's so very accomplished and superior compared to Harriet and is exactly Emma's age. And I think because so many times people are comparing the two, it kind of feels like one has to prove that the other one is better than the other. And they actually do openly admit to each other at one point that they had like this sense of jealousy towards one another. So that's kind of like the internal forces of why they never really became friends. But then, you know, on the flip side, you have Emma and Harriet. And it starts off, honestly, pretty toxic because, like, Emma does, like, openly manipulate Harriet. I think that especially comes through, like, in the very beginning with the letter and answering the letter. Like, honestly, even, like, my annotation for that scene was emotional manipulation girl boss. Because, you know, she gets the proposal from Mr. Martin. Like, Harriet gets the proposal. And she's kind of seeking Emma's advice and guidance and trying to, you know, have Emma just tell her what to do because she doesn't know. And Emma very sneakily is kind of like, well, you know, I can never like say what you should do. I can't speak to like your love. I can't write the letter for you. That has to be in your own words. But like, even though that's what she's saying, I mean, the subtext and even Harriet's picking up is that Emma does not approve of this relationship at all or this match at all. And it comes through like very well in this scene. I'm not going to read the whole page. I'm not that good at reading out loud, but so that's kind of like where we start. And then we end the relationship with Emma finding like Emma just being a lot more compassionate towards Harriet, being a lot more concerned about Harriet just as a person and her feelings and what she's going through, and not so much of like where she is in society. And I think that really comes through with Emma being so hesitant to tell Harriet that she loves Mr. Knightley. And I think like you see Emma want to sacrifice her own happiness for a minute. And she almost does until, you know, Mr. Knightley comes and says, hey, no, like I do love you. And even then, like Emma's still trying to figure out like, okay, how do I break this to Harriet? Like I don't want her to have to feel this pain again. And she really does own up to what she did to Harriet in the beginning with, you know, kind of dissuading her from Mr. Martin very well towards the end. And they have like a very nice resolution. But at the same time, they kind of say like after all of them are married that they don't really like stay as close of friends. But they're still friends, you know, it fades, but it's not like it's gone forever or anything like that. And I kind of think that's like an interesting sentiment to see, because I think that's very true for today still. Like once that you get married, then your friendships aren't as the same intensity as maybe when you were single or when you didn't have a significant other or like whatever. And I think it's like very common, and I think it's just like we still kind of have a society where we put our significant other on like a pedestal compared to the rest of our relationships. And that's not necessarily saying it's a good or a bad thing. I just find that it's interesting that that still holds true today. Like, there's also kind of an interesting foil between Emma and Harriet protege relationship, and then Jane and Mrs. Elton protege relationship that we see later on. Mrs. Elton is also very rich and very vain, kind of like Emma in the beginning of the book. But we don't see the transformation with her as we do with Emma. Actually, we were really supposed to hate Mrs. Elton in the book, and that comes through very well. I really didn't, like, there's multiple times that I am just like, God, this woman. So she doesn't have the same transformation that Emma does, and I don't know if I'm quite understanding it the way that I'm supposed to understand it, but I did think that it was very interesting seeing the dynamics between Jane and Mrs. Elton versus the dynamics of Emma and Harriet, and kind of seeing, like, looking through a mirror of, like, okay, if Emma didn't make this change in herself and didn't recognize her flaws and didn't recognize her own classism and all of it, like, would she end up like how we're seeing Mrs. Elton and Jane's relationship? Because it's very, like, Mrs. Elton is... in some, she's, like, very controlling of Jane, doesn't really consider Jane's feelings. She's, like, bulldozes over her all the time, and acts like she's amazing and superior for doing that because Jane is so lowly. I mean, she's lower middle class, basically, and she clearly needs some guidance, and Jane doesn't really have, like, the backbone exactly to say, like, hey, you need to stop. And also, like, there could be some class dynamics there too, is why she doesn't say, hey, you need to stop. She does try to, like, kind of lightly be like, this is not okay. You can't just, like, make these arrangements for me. It is my life. I'm not a puppet. There is, like, kind of an allusion to that at some point, but, like, it's not very strong from what I remember. So I just think that whole dynamic is interesting, and how if Emma didn't change her ways, we could have seen that with Emma and Harriet. But the only other big tab that I had was the sass. And I went through and I tried to find, like, what was kind of my favorite line, so to speak. And it was actually about Mrs. Elton, because it's at the very bottom. And they're all at I think this is during a party. There's some kind of gathering that they're all at. And it says, Mr. Knightley seemed to be trying not to smile, and succeeded without difficulty upon Mrs. Elton beginning to talk to him. That was my favorite sass line, personally. So, I mean, that's those are, like, all of, like, my actual intellectual thoughts. I could be wrong in some places, let's be real. I didn't, like, go through this as if I'm writing, like, a literature paper. There's maybe some things I misremembered. There's maybe some things I didn't quite understand to the effect that I should have understood them, or how it was intended. So, like, that's, like, my disclaimer to everything that I had just said. But overall, I really did enjoy Emma. I did actually wind up watching the 2020 movie, and I really liked doing that. It's still different, you know, like, it's not quite like the book, but I think you could say that for every adaptation, but it's still one that I just find, like, really enjoyable. I love, like, the cinematography a lot, and I think it does a lot for it. And also, like, I love the costume design. It's just, like, it gets you in the moment for sure. I almost cried, honestly. And I think I almost cried because I was reading the book and, like, I understood more of, like, the backstory and, like, what was going on. I actually did not cry reading the book, but I don't know. I have a harder time crying for books than I do for movies. But anyways, I know that, like, Emma's, like, one of, like, the top one for people. Like, it's a very common one to be, like, the favorite of the Jane Austen books. I think at the end of, like, my whole Jane Austen journey, I might try to do, like, a tier list of, like, what I felt like was my favorite. So far, I am still a Pride and Prejudice stan, but, like, you know, we got, like, 5 more books to go through, so I really can't say that. But the main thing with Emma that I would at least like to leave on is that she's a very fun character. Even though at one point I mentioned that she sometimes frustrates me, and, like, you can still be frustrating and fun at the same time. That's an option. And I just feel like Emma as a character just carries so much of, like, what the book is and why people love it and what makes it Emma. I mean, you know, as the title would suggest. I can't believe that I'm done with Emma. It still hasn't really sunk in. But yeah, so I'll see you guys in March. Crazy. Early in the morning, so. What the heck?